To welcome everybody and thank you for coming to tonight's event. As everyone hopefully knew, or hopefully you remember if you were here last time, last March we had one of the most entertaining and engaging and informative author events we've had at this store in quite some time. And Ken let his guard down and came back again, so I'm hoping that we can repeat that. I'm someone who kind of came of age late. It was one of the rare times where one of the younger people in the room, but I kind of came of age in the mid-'70s, so I missed an awful lot of what went around the first time. I did the best I could to try to catch up with the anti-war movement and the LGBT movement and a lot of the other progressive civil rights movements. And I really thought I was up to speed until I heard Ken speak last time, and until I read the first of the 4 volumes and found out there's some amazing things out there that I was completely unaware of. And I'll tip my hand real quickly, too. I've not read the second book yet, so I'm assuming by the time I leave today, I'll be even more well-informed. Ken was instrumental in the underground press at MSU during the 1960s. And I think that the stories that you'll hear tonight, if they're anywhere close to being as cool as the ones from the first go-around were, are going to be engaging and just as informative. So without further ado, Ken Wachsberger.
Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott. And it's great to be back here. It really is. When I spoke here last time, it was really one of the best events of my life. I really had a great show. I loved the turnout, and so it's really nice to be back. Thank you for coming. If you were here the last time, thanks for coming again. And if Scott invites me to come back for Volume 3 and Volume 4, thanks in advance for coming. There's some great stories in there, so I hope you come. But tonight I'm real pleased to be talking about Michael Kindman. And I look forward to hearing what other folks have to say later on. Michael was important to me because my experience with the underground press was the most important experience of my formative adult years. And Michael was one of the pioneers of the underground press. He was important to a number of you because he was a friend. We knew him as Michael. Later on in his life, he became known as Mica. I like to think that I knew Michael better than anyone in the world who never met him. I never met him. It took him 2 years to write his story. And during the time that we worked together, we communicated over the phone. We communicated over the mail. Now we call it snail mail because we have email to compare it to, but then we didn't really have email. So it was just the regular mail and the phone. But I never met him in person. I never shook his hand, never hugged him. Never saw his facial expressions as we discussed philosophy. But his name loomed large to me because he was the founder of the paper, which was the first underground paper in East Lansing, and also was one of the first 5 members of Underground Press Syndicate, which was the first major network of underground papers. So Michael was an important figure, but to me, my experience with the underground press came 2 underground press generations later, when I started working on Joint Issue, which was the underground paper of the early 70s here. I say 2 generations. You had the paper, and then you had kind of a group of papers, Swill and Squeal, generation. Was that yours, Charlie? Okay.
I like Swill and Squeal.
That was a good one.
All 3 issues.
They're great issues, though. Swill and Squeal, Generation, Bogue Street Bridge, and Red Apple News. All kind of, what was that?
Lansing Star.
Okay. No, that was later.
Right.
We're talking generations. Those were the generation that followed the paper. And then after that was Joint Issue. And so 2 generations apart, I always thought of Michael as my spiritual grandfather. Although I'm sure if I'd ever told him that, he would have probably laughed. But that was always how I felt about him. He was also important on the national level, very important. When I began compiling stories for what became the first edition of Joint Issue, which came out in 1993, I was talking to one prospective author and telling him some of the stories that I wanted, that were going to be in it already, some of the papers that already had committed to being part of it, some of the writers who were going to be writing for it. And when I mentioned Michael's name, he stopped me. He said, and he didn't know I was from East Lansing. We were just talking over the phone. He stopped me and he said, I got to tell you, Michael really influenced my life, my experience as a radical. He himself was one of the key figures back then, and he was telling me how important Michael was to him. Later on, when I began preparing for this edition, and this is just a quick background. This is actually the second edition of Voices from the Underground. It came out originally in 1993. It was a huge book, 600 pages, laid out in an 8.5 by 11 two-column format. It was literally the equivalent of 4 books. I mean, literally 4 books. And Michael's was the longest story in it. So when I began creating the second edition, which is an updated and expanded version of the first, I knew Michael's had to be its own book, and so now it is. I'm real pleased about that. But when I was in the process of preparing it, I read the manuscript over again just to get psyched up for the new adventure of creating its own book. And I was reminded that Paul Krassner had been part of the paper. He had done just a small role. He had called the paper one time and asked to offered to do a fundraiser for them. Now anybody who's part of the 60s period knows Paul Krassner. He was one of the legends himself. He founded the Realist in, I believe, 1959. He was one of the co-founders of the Yippies. But he was called, some people consider him the father of the underground press. When he heard that, he immediately demanded a paternity test. It actually was People magazine that called that, so you don't have to, it doesn't have a whole lot of credibility, but it did get out. He's the father of the underground press. So anyhow, when I saw that he was part of it, and by the way, he did do the fundraiser. They had an interesting discussion at it. They talked about various ways to say fuck communism, ball communism, bed communism, meaningful relationship communism. So it must have been a pretty wild conversation, but this was Paul Krassner. So when I read that, I said he's got to be part of this book. I was looking for someone to write the foreword. So I contacted him, and he got back to me, and he said, Ken, I got to tell you, I've done a lot of writing over the years, but I've never written a novel. In all my life, I've never written a novel, and now, for the first time, I'm writing my novel. He said, I've put aside all my writing, all my other projects, all my tasks. He was devoting full time to writing his novel. And I was quite sure that what he was doing was giving me a polite way to say, so I'm sorry, I can't accept your offer. But instead he said, but I got to tell you, I was really intrigued by your offer, and I would be honored to write the foreword. So, and that's, you open up the book, that's the first part of the text you see, Paul Krassner's foreword. Really honor, and a real tribute, I think, to Michael. That's really the point. What is the underground press? That's what we're talking about. Most of you, I'm sure, know about it, but some of you may not. So I want to just briefly say that the underground press was the dissident press, the anti-war press, the non-corporate press during the Vietnam years. There were papers representing the gay, the lesbian, the feminist, the black, the Native American, the Puerto Rican, the military, the Southern consciousness, the prisoners' rights, the rank and file, the New Age, the psychedelic, the socialist, all these different voices of what we knew of as the anti-war movement, the counterculture, all of them had their own underground papers. They were all united against the war. But beyond that, they all spoke to different audiences. And so my goal when I began conceptualizing Voices from the Underground was to capture as many of these voices as I could. And so one day I was talking to Charlie Shively on the phone. Charlie was one of the key figures on a paper called Fag Rag. Fag Rag was one of the gay papers that was an outgrowth of the Stonewall Rebellion. The Stonewall Rebellion in 1969, that was when gays and lesbians that used to get, their bars used to get busted on a regular basis. And it would just, they get busted, then everything would resume to normal. They get busted again. It was just a regular harassment. One night, they fought back. They said no. And then they fought the cops. It was just amazing. And this went on for like 3 nights. And what happened as a result of this was gay lesbian consciousness rose to a level, I'd say in this country, probably in the world, I don't know, that's never been achieved before. And by the time that was done, there were Gay Liberation Front chapters all over the country. And a lot of them had their own newspapers. So you had, in Detroit, you had the Gay Liberator. In San Francisco, you had Gay Sunshine. And so in Boston, we had Fag Rag, and that was the paper that I was looking at right now. I was talking to Charlie, and Charlie had just agreed at this point to write his history, so I was real excited about that. His history, by the way, will be in Volume 3, the one that's coming up. So we were talking afterwards, just kind of the afterglow, I guess, of my getting another contributor. And I asked him if he knew anybody who had been an insider with a paper called Avatar. Now, Avatar, I knew about that because Avatar was a member of Underground Press Syndicate, like Joint Issue, and we used to exchange. All the UPS Underground Press Syndicate papers used to exchange. So I got all these papers from all over the country, and I read them all. I just loved doing that. And this was one of the papers, and I was really attracted to it. It was an anti-war paper, like all the Underground Press papers, but it was different. It talked less about war and more about personal development. Less about hatred, more about poetry. At least that was the impression that I had of it back when. And so I was attracted to it. But by the time I began compiling stories for Voices from the Underground, I knew a little bit more about it. What I learned was that Avatar was put out by a group called the Fort Hill Community. And the Fort Hill Community was a personality cult that revolved around a musician turned cult leader named Mel Lyman. And I've never been a fan of cults, but I figured, okay, this is the 60s and the 70s were a period where there were a lot of cults. I mean, you know them, the Jim Jones group in San Francisco. We had the Moonies. We had the Divine Light Mission, the 13-year-old kid from India who was, the perfect master. A lot of white suburban kids were falling in line behind him. And so anyhow, there were a lot of cults, and I thought, well, okay, they were putting out a paper. I wanted to get an insider perspective. I thought that would be really interesting. The Fort Hill Community was actually one of the main one, a key one. It was written about in David Felton's book. It was a classic book called Mindfuckers. And he focused on a couple of these groups, but the two main ones he focused on were the Fort Hill Community and another group that some of you might have heard of, Charlie Manson's group. The Family, okay? So these were the two groups that he's focusing on, and one of them is Avatar. And so by the time I was talking to Charlie on, about Voices from the Underground, by this time I knew about Avatar. But I still thought, okay, I'd like to have an insider story. So I asked him if he knew of anybody who had been a key person on Avatar. They were both from Boston. That was the connection there. So he said to me, well, I know somebody who was part of it, but he was kind of peripheral. And I thought, well, okay, the way I got people to write stories, I always wanted the key people, not just anybody, but key people who really insiders. But in order to get to them, all I needed was anybody from the staff. And then I would talk to that person. If that was the wrong person, I'd say, well, who would you recommend? And they'd cut me someone else. I'd get someone else. Eventually, I could find the right person. So peripheral was good. That was a foot in the door. So he said, someone who's kind of peripheral. His name is Michael Kindman. He's living out in San Francisco. He's going by the name of Mica now. I said, okay, cool. So I called up this Michael Kindman. This is 27 years later, from when it actually happened. I called up Michael Kindman, and I explained the project to him and what I was looking for. And I said, could you write a history of Avatar? And he said to me, well, I was part of the paper. He agreed with what Charlie said. He was kind of peripheral to it. He said, I could write a story if you wanted. But he said, but I was really better known for my association with a paper from the Midwest. And that's all he said. I mean, I didn't tell him I'm from East Lansing, or I was living in Ann Arbor at the time, but either way, I didn't say that. He said, a paper from the Midwest. And suddenly I had this catharsis. I said, oh my God, you're Michael Kindman. and I'm sure this is one of the most profound realizations of the obvious that's ever been recorded. I mean, I called asking for Michael Kindman. He said, I'm Michael Kindman. I said, oh, you're Michael Kindman. I felt like an idiot, so we started talking. He said, well, I'd be happy to write it. Which one would you like me to do? And he said, I'm also out in San Francisco. I've worked on papers out there. Which one would you like me to write? So I made what probably was one of the best journalistic decisions of my life. I said, just tell me your story. And the result is Michael's Odyssey through the Underground Press. I had no idea it was going to be that long. Most of the stories in the anthologies are 20, 30 pages. His was a book. But it was an amazing story. It's funny at times, it's sad at times, it's inspirational at times. Sometimes it's just a real bummer. But it's brilliant. I mean, it's insightful, and clearly he's passionate. I mean, the whole book, he's passionate about what he was saying. He really, really had a story that he had to tell. And I think part of it was because he went through this cult experience and he was living with this experience that he had to get down on paper. But it was way more than I expected, but it was great. I loved hearing it. It begins in 1963 when he came to MSU. He was one of 200 brilliant high schoolers from around the country who had been given national merit scholarships that were good only at MSU. Only this was the period when MSU was trying to shed its reputation as the cow college, Moo U. Okay, it was trying to develop its reputation as a great center of learning. So they invited all these national merit scholars, and these national merit scholars came with this idea of, they figured they were coming to some kind of a Mecca, some kind of an intellectually stimulating environment. Instead, they came to Moo U. So immediately, some of them started, looking elsewhere. I mean, they weren't satisfied here. They started looking elsewhere. Michael got a job on State News, which is the school newspaper. He worked as a writer. He worked as an editor, and in this position, he started to get, learn a little bit more about what was happening off campus in the surrounding community. And so he got in with some of the anti-war folks. Not because he was seeking it out. I think they actually sought him out. I can't remember, but they met, And so he became aware of this country in Southeast Asia called Vietnam. And he became aware of the open housing issues that were happening around that time. And he began to write about them. And it didn't fit real well with the uppers at the State News. And so they began trying to censor him in various ways. And he saw this. Thank you. He felt this, and he finally said, "No, I don't like this anymore." And he dropped out, and he founded the paper. And so in his role as the paper, this brought a great group of radicals together. They wrote again about Vietnam. They wrote about open housing, but they covered other issues as well. As an organizer, we know that when we want to bring the people from here to there, you don't start out there. You got to go to where the people are and move forward. Well, the people on campus, students, what were their issues back then? It seems really quaint to talk about it right now, but the issues then were women's hours. Okay, remember the men could stay out as long as they wanted. Women had to be back at midnight. Co-ed dorm. What's that? 11? Oh, sorry about that. Okay.
Except on weekends.
I just know I had to buy flowers all the time because I got them back late. Co-ed dorms. Co-ed dorms. You had in Wonders. You had North Wonders for the men, South Wonders for the women. So these were issues, and these are other issues that revolved around the common theme of what we knew then as in loco parentis. Okay, remember that? In loco parentis, which means basically when you go away to school, the school takes the role of your parent. I was at local parentis. I thought it meant your parents are crazy, but that's not what it meant. It meant that the parents take the school takes your place. And so this became a big issue, and so the paper wrote about that. And then there was another issue, the classic issue, really what put the paper on the map. This was a period when MSU was expanding tremendously. Not only bringing in more people, but physically the area was getting bigger and bigger. They're building dorms. They were getting more land. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but the dorms on the far east. Acres, Fee, Hubbard. If I'm not mistaken, according to the original game plan of expansion, that was supposed to be the center of campus. But I'm not sure about that, but that's what I've always heard. But the funds dried up. What happened was that MSU was the #1 front organization for the CIA's expansion in Vietnam. Vietnam, the CIA was carding the peasants, pushing the peasants from the country into the cities, and then IDing them. This is what we were doing to the Vietnamese, and it was costing a lot of money, and the government didn't want anyone to know what was happening. So the government paid MSU, give all this money to MSU, and MSU just sent it right over to Vietnam. And so you had people working in Vietnam who were called professors, who never showed up on campus. They were in Vietnam all the time. So this was a huge scandal, and although we didn't know about it until a magazine, the number one muckraking magazine at the time, Ramparts, came to town and worked with Michael and some of the other people from the paper to expose what was going on. And it was a huge scandal. Gary, you got to step forward. Got to step forward. Get the camera on Gary. That T-shirt that he's wearing.
Is the cover of the
Step
forward more.
I didn't pay him to do this. This was
Just a coincidence.
just a coincidence. That was the cover. That was the cover of Ramparts magazine.
That's
April of
Madam
six-
New.
April of
Yeah.
Dressed as an MSU cheerleader.
Madam Newen and MSU cheerleaders.
Yeah.
outfit.
And John Hanna inside is the coach.
Yeah.
So that was great. But that was the cover of the magazine that had the expose. And the paper wrote about this also. But this was a huge expose, and the paper was part of it. So this is what Michael was involved in while he was working on the paper. But at some point around 1968, I think it was 3 years after he'd founded the paper, he started looking eastward. They were members, of course, of UPS also. I told you the paper was one of the first 5 members. So he was reading copies of Avatar too. And he looked at it and he was very impressed by this paper. And so he and a friend of his went east to visit the Avatar staff. And they were welcomed by the paper there, by the whole community, the Fort Hill community, and they became part of it. And I think, he didn't know it was a cult. I mean, who knew about cults in 1968? But I think, from my reading of the book, from my reading of his story, I think that they knew that who he was. I mean, they knew he was, a big leader in East Lansing, that he was well respected. I believe that they really tried to beat him down. I mean, they didn't want him to, they weren't going to treat him as an equal. They didn't want him to be, one of the leaders, maybe be threatening or something. So they really mind messed him. Mind fuckers. That was the name of David Felton's book. His friend, she was welcomed right in, no problem. Michael never really was able to be one of the group. I mean, I didn't think so. He always was struggling with it. Sometimes he'd be welcomed in. Sometimes he'd be ostracized. He worked on the paper then, partly, but he also worked as a carpenter. The building that was his real profession besides writing, and so he never really was able to blend in with the group. There was always that stress, and so like cults, what they do. Part of him wanted to be part of it. There's a sense of belonging. This is my community now, and so he really tried to become part of it. But then there was part of him that said, "Whoa, this is really screwed up. I got to get out of here." And so I know, I could see that he was going both ways at the same time. Once you got your family, it's hard to leave them, as much as some people try. So it took him a long time. It took a long time to get away. But finally, 5 years after he joined the group, he was at this point living in Kansas, which is a western outpost of the group. So he was still part of the Fort Hill community, but he was living in Kansas. He finally made his escape. And it's not like they had guns on him. It wasn't that kind of escape. He wasn't behind bars, but it was a mental thing. He had to get away. And he went out west.
No, he came here first. He stayed at my house.
Okay, you're right. Thank you, Maggie. Okay,
Very
but the ultimate flow. Thank you. The ultimate flow was he went out west. He came out as a gay man, changed his name to Mica, and by the time I caught up with him, he was working with a group as a radical. It was a gay pagan spiritual group called Radical Fairies. Real important group. It was founded by Harry Hay. Harry Hay was the founder in the 50s of the Mattachine Society, which was one of the first major gay, maybe the first, I'm not sure, major gay group around. They had their own paper called the Mattachine Review, which was one of the 3 major gay lesbian papers of the 50s. They had that paper, you had a paper called One, and you had a paper called The Ladder. But this was the first one. So this was Harry Hay who founded this. Now later on, he founded out west the paper the group called the Radical Fairies. So when
It's
I caught
also the first gay group in San Francisco to have a clinic for AIDS patients.
the Radical Fairies.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. I
First
didn't know
AIDS
that.
clinic was by Michael.
Thank you. So by the time, anyhow, it was because of my awareness. When I first became interested in him writing his piece. I didn't know he was gay at that time. I mean, I was attracted to his underground pressness. And that's why I wanted Paul Krassner to write a foreword. I mean, it really fit. You know, he's underground press. Paul Krassner, it really was great. But once I realized that he was gay, I said, okay, this has to be a major part of the story also. And so I was real pleased that Tommy Avicoli Mica, who is a gay activist, writer, a former underground press person himself, worked with some of the gay papers in Philadelphia in the 60s and 70s. He wrote the second foreword to Mica's piece. I was really, really honored that he agreed to write that. So this is what I knew about Mica by the time I caught up with him, but there was one other thing. He was dying of AIDS. And real sad. I mean, who knew? But he was positive. He was always positive, and always positive. He really believed he was going to make it past, survive. But he didn't. 2 months after finishing his manuscript, I got a call from his partner that he'd passed away. So it was really sad, but I really believe that he lived that extra period because he was writing his story. Ironically, he was the second person whose story I wrote who died soon after finishing the story with me. That may
There must
explain.
be a lesson.
It may explain why I can't get people to work with me anymore. But really, I believe he lived that extra time because of that. I mean, this is really it is another story, but this is a whole testament to the power of words and writing for self-discovery. I've taught that as a class, writing for self-discovery, and his story really showed that to me. But he ultimately died. Meanwhile, during this period, I was trying to find a publisher for the first edition. And I had this huge book, and I had an agent who was really interested in it. One of the bigwig New York agents loved the book, and he was passing it around to the different houses, and they were liking the book but not going with it. One of the publishers he contacted that I was holding on to the book for a long time. Finally, the agent said, what's the story? Do you want it or don't you? He said, oh, I'm sorry. He apologized for taking so long to return. He said, I was reading it. In other words, he really liked that. Another publisher gave it, quote unquote, a rave rejection. Love the book. Love the book. Don't want to publish it. So this is what we were getting. I think that, this was the early 90s. It was in the early 90s. The government was not at this point, and society, I think, wasn't really ready to deal with the fact that we had lost the Vietnam War. We'd gotten pounded in the Vietnam War. And in fact, that we were actually the bad guys in Vietnam. I mean, it's, this was the real lesson that we learned from Vietnam, and I don't think...
Some of us learned.
Some of, those of us who are writing this particular book. So it was real tough to find a publisher. And somewhere along the way, as this was happening, we started to realize that in the same way that the underground press of the 60s and 70s had been created in order to get the story of what was happening in Vietnam out to the people, now in the 90s we were going to have to create our own publishing house in order to get the story of that story out to the people. And so we created a press to do it, and we named it Mica Press. So that's the story. Tonight we're celebrating Mica's life, and I look forward to hearing what folks have to say. And I thank you for your time. Thank you very much.